Welcome to the Real Estate Investor Podcast. I'm your host, Gary Lipsky of Break of Day Capital. I talk to leading experts to discuss a wide range of subjects to educate investors on best-in-class practices to build legacy wealth and positively impact communities. Let's jump in. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Real Estate Investor Podcast. I'm your host, Gary Lipsky with Break of Day Capital. Be sure to join our Facebook group, Asset Management Mastery, where we have a great community of thousands of like-minded individuals sharing resources and best practices. Hey everyone, we have launched the BODC Multifamily Impact Fund. Invest with a trusted operator with a track record of success. Our fund offers diversification, risk mitigation, tax benefits, and stringent acquisition criteria. If you'd like to learn more, head over to our website at breakofdaycapital.com.
Choosing the right insurance coverage for multifamily properties isn't that complicated if you know who to talk to. At the Garzella Group, we're uniquely qualified to help you navigate the range of policy choices you have, and we're committed to saving you 30% in the process. We do intensive market research and have nationwide relationships, so we can find coverage other insurance brokers simply can't. We should talk. Go to quotenow.biz and we'll start the conversation.
Today on the podcast, we have my good friend Mauricio Rauld, who was on episode 13 and episode 106. Mauricio is the founder of and CEO of Premier Law Group, a premier boutique securities law firm which specializes in Reg D exempt offerings. And Mauricio is also a regular contributor to the Real Estate Guys radio show and is Robert Helm's personal advisor. Mauricio, can you start by telling the listeners a little bit more about yourself and what you do?
I help real estate syndicators stay out of jail. That's my job. My job is to make sure when they're raising capital, they're following all the federal and state securities laws. And that's it's really, right now, that's all we do. Although we're starting to expand into real estate transactions and estate planning. We're actually that's one of my big goals for 2024 is just to kind of help the real estate syndicator be a little bit more holistic and help them all that stuff. And then more relevant for this episode is I am a former recovering asset protection attorney. So back when I started practicing 20 some odd years ago, started the firm, I did a lot of asset protection. In fact, it was the majority of my business. Don't do it anymore, but obviously I'm pretty well versed and I'm excited to talk about some of the intricacies and layers of that topic.
Awesome. Well, great to have you. It's funny, we live about an hour away from each other, but we only see each other far, far away in New York or Texas or anywhere but California.
Yeah. So I just saw you a couple of weeks ago in New York. I mean, you can't get any further away. And then before that, I saw you in Dallas. And but we recorded some content in New York. So I'm looking forward to releasing that here pretty soon too. So maybe that may already be out by the time this gets released. If not, look out for it.
All right. Awesome. Well, you mentioned asset protection. Let's talk about the 6 layers of asset protection.
Yeah. So look, we were just talking about this offline. Like I came up with this idea of layers because, and when I say layers, I make the analogy of layers of clothing, right? Like, so you might leave your house with a t-shirt on, and if it's a nice sunny day, like it is today in Southern California, that might be just good enough, right? But if it's a little chillier, you may have to put like a long sleeve shirt on, right? And as it gets, if it starts to rain or whatever, you get your jacket on. It depends on what's out there will dictate, what layer. You can't just say, well, a t-shirt's all you need, or a winter coat is all you need. I'm like, wait, I don't need to wear a winter coat if it's 90 degrees outside, right? And yet on the asset protection world, people do that all the time. They like set up asset protection trusts and all of this really complicated stuff. And they're like, they just bought their first duplex, right? And on the other hand, they've got all these assets and they're like, oh, I just have insurance. Like insurance is enough. And it always drives me crazy. And so I've been kind of talking about these 6 layers because there is no one layer that is impenetrable. Like you give me any asset protection strategy you want, I will poke a hole in it. There's none of them out there. You can say, oh, I do this. I'm like, well, here's the issue with that. And here's the hole I can find and I can see. And plaintiffs lawyers do the same thing. And so by creating these layers, or sometimes people call it like the layers of onions, like you just want to make it as complicated as possible for somebody, a plaintiff's lawyer particularly, to find your assets or come after you because there's just layer after layer after layer and they have to peel it off. And for most of them, it's like, you know what, it's not even worth it. Versus if it's just one strategy, like, oh, I know how to get around that one, or I know how to get around this one. So anyway, so I came up with the 6, and let's talk about them. So number one, kind of a little. So the number one is the free variety. There are certain asset protection benefits that you get that are actually quote unquote free. So you should definitely take advantage of them. They're not necessarily automatic. So the homestead exemption is a great one. So your equity in your home, part of that may or most likely is protected. Now, the problem is it's not a lot. I don't know if you know this or not, but California used to be really crappy. I think that's a legal term. It used to protect, like $15,000 or $30,000. I mean, and the average home here is like 800 grand or $1 million. It was nothing. But they recently updated that to like 600,000 or 700,000, depending on what county you live in. So you have that's actually legit protection. But in a lot of states, you actually have to file something with the recorder's office to get that. A lot of times it only protects you in bankruptcy, so you still end up losing the house. But so it's not perfect, but a homestead exemption is an example of a free protection. Your wages is another one where not all of them, by the way, but some percentage of your wages, certainly to live off, will be protected. IRAs, not necessarily IRAs, 401ks, some of the retirement accounts, pension funds, right? Ask OJ Simpson. He has both homestead in Florida, which is 100%, and he has an NFL pension, untouchable. So he's walking around with $100 million judgment. I think at this point it's gone up to $100 million with interest and everything. And he's walking in Florida and he's like, nobody can touch him because he's got the homestead exemption and he's got the NFL pension. So anyway, so that's number one, is the free. So then the next layer, which is usually the first layer really that you're looking at if you're just starting out, we'll use real estate because obviously we're in the real estate world. You're buying a single family home, you bought your first rental, whatever, insurance. That has to be always your first layer of defense, right? That's just paramount. That's just basic. Get that first layer of defense because it's relatively inexpensive vis-a-vis the benefits you get. And it just is. It's always your first line of defense, no matter what. Even when I talk about entity structuring, which we'll talk about in a second, LLCs, those are your backstops. Like your first layer is going to be the insurance. And then if that fails, you want to have a backstop, which is usually going to be something like an LLC or something. And so the issue is just with insurance, it's just everybody, this is one of my pet peeves. I was like, just get insurance. And it's like, okay, well, first of all, there's something called exclusions on insurance policies. So not everything is covered. And so my biggest pet peeve is that people are walking around making their monthly payments thinking they're covered when in fact they're not. And then when something actually does happen and they call the insurance company, that's when they find out, I had a false sense of security. It really doesn't cover me. So at the very least, I would have, ideally you have there's an attorney called an insurance attorney, for a grand or two, they'll review your policy for you and at least tell you where the holes are. And then you can then make a business decision whether you want to plug them with some supplemental coverage or whatever. But insurance is not the end all be all, not to mention that most people are underinsured. They have like $1 million policy or $2 million policy. But, I always give the example, the story of my alma mater at UC Berkeley. There was a college party, one of the buildings and the balcony collapsed. Killed 6 people, whatever. I mean, that's mere $1 million is not going anywhere, right? Plus it gets eaten up by litigation fees. And, so like a lot of people are uninsured. So anyway, insurance is just not end all be all. It's always your first line of defense, but never rely on insurance exclusively. Another one, for example, people always, I just get an umbrella policy. Like I just get my home umbrella. Okay. Well, a lot of umbrella policies don't cover business issues, right? So if you have a rental business in an LLC and that's considered business, well, your umbrella may not cover you for that. Again, you just need somebody to take a look at that policy and make sure you understand, yes, this will cover my rentals if somebody slips and falls on my rental property. So anyway, so that's the next layer of defense. The third layer, and then I'll take a break so you can dig in there for a little bit, is an interesting one because it's one of my favorites, but in and of itself, it doesn't have anything magical, but privacy is a big layer, right? And in and of itself, it's not magical. You're not using privacy to hide anything. You should always be comfortable. We always say this, like if you have an asset protection plan, you should always be comfortable to show that entire plan to a judge, for example. Say, judge, here's how I've structured my affairs, and it's good. We don't rely on hiding assets or privacy as a layer of protection, but it does go a long, long way. Back in the day, when I graduated college, I took a year, it's actually almost like a year and a half off, like a little sabbatical between college and law school. And I went to work for a really well-known plaintiff's attorney up in San Francisco. And so I handled all these intakes and whatever. And what I realized, and I kind of knew already, but plaintiff's lawyers work on contingency, right? Meaning they don't get paid unless you get paid, right? And so the first thing a plaintiff's lawyer does is they do an asset search. So that's what we would do. We'd scour around. We're like, we'll search the public records. Do you own any property, a personal home, rental income, whatever? Let's see what you got. Oh, you found a property with equity. Great. I would do a bank account sweep. You can easily find bank accounts, brokerage accounts. All of those are relatively, inexpensive for a plaintiff's lawyer to do. And if they find something, hey, you got all this property or a personal residence or whatever, then you become a nice big fat target. And you're like, great, I know that if I spend the next 3 years of my life going after this, I'm going to go after Gary. And after 3 years, when I finally get that guy, I know he's got money to pay. Versus if I do that same search and I don't find anything, like I can't find a home, or I find a home and it's like underwater, right? Because you've got 3 mortgages on it, and I see no bank, or I find a bank account with like $5,000 on it. I don't see anything else. I'm less likely to go after you because I don't get to bring you in and ask you about your assets until after I have a judgment. That's a really important thing. Before a judgment is obtained, whether you have the ability to pay me is irrelevant. So I can't ask you to come in for a deposition or send you information and say, Gary, tell me all the stuff you own. It's like, it's irrelevant. I only get to do that after I get a judgment. But a plaintiff's lawyer is not going to spend 3 years busting his or her butt to get a judgment against Gary. Yay, I got this big judgment against Gary, and then I got to go collect, and only then do I find out whether he's got money or not. They just don't want to do that. And so if they don't find any assets, typically they'll know, oh, there's an insurance policy, right? $1 million here, $2 million here. Let's just settle for insurance policy. So in and of itself, privacy isn't whatever, but it helps you in those scenarios. It helps you if you're a real estate investor, when your tenant slips and falls and they want to sue somebody, they're going to search for the title, who owns the property. And when there's an LLC there instead of your personal name, and you're not the registered agent, you're not the manager, like it's private. They don't know who to sue. Even my clients, every so often, it doesn't happen in a while, but obviously you guys, you're buying multifamily buildings. Things happen, right? Like I've had lawsuits against the buildings where like somebody gets shot on the property, or they're taking a shower and the roof falls on them. I mean, there's legit injuries. But the owner, my client, never gets mentioned in the lawsuit. It's always the owner of the property, which is the LLC, maybe the manager, because they can see that on the public records, the management LLC, and then the property manager. My John Doe, they don't know who he is or she is. And so they can't even get, anyway. So that's where privacy comes in. It's a really nice tool, especially when it's used in conjunction with having an insurance policy, because now they can settle for insurance, or LLC, which is going to be the next layer.
So privacy is a good thing, because I hear a lot. I see a lot on the message boards, like, should I do register in Wyoming and create an LLC there to have that privacy? And I've talked to lawyers when I'm setting up entities all the time for each property we purchase, and they're just saying it's not really worth it to go through Wyoming. I'm curious what your thoughts are. Typically, when we're borrowing, we'll create a Delaware entity. That's for the borrowing entity. But for our property entities, it's usually Arizona, where we're purchasing properties.
Yeah. So if you're looking specifically for the privacy piece of it, there's a bunch of ways to do it. My favorite is using Wyoming, but not to set up not to set up your property LLCs or your businesses in Wyoming. It's to set up the manager LLC in Wyoming, because there's a few states, like Arizona is one of them, that require you to put who the owner is, but most states don't require you to, when you file your entity. So like if you're in Texas, for example, Texas is not going to ask you who the owner of your Texas LLC is, but they want to know who the manager is. So when it's time to put the manager in there, then you put this Wyoming LLC. So now that shows up on the public records. And if they go to Wyoming, they can't find it, because Wyoming is one of the few states, that's why we love it from a privacy standpoint, that Wyoming themselves don't know who the owner manager is. It's not requested, and they don't know. Now, if they absolutely need it for some reason, if the state really needs that information, the registered agent is required to keep that information. But literally somebody could fly to Wyoming, go to the Secretary of State, and physically tell me, give me this LLC information, and they won't have the owner. So it's a great privacy place. But again, if you have a property in Texas, set up a Texas LLC, just have the Wyoming be the manager. And again, some states do require you to disclose the members or the owners, but most do. Again, Arizona is one of them. I think if you own more than 20%, you've got to disclose ownership. But there's so then you can do other techniques, like a nominee service or something, that somebody just acts as the owner might be. There's some other techniques to do that, like in Arizona. But Wyoming, I love it for privacy. for a couple of reasons. One is the privacy. And the other nice thing about Wyoming is that failure to keep proper corporate records is not grounds for losing your privacy, your protection, which as you may know, nobody knows how to keep records and nobody really does a good job of that, which is a little bit of a weakling there. But at least in that state, that's not gonna get against you.
Got it. All right. So part of our six layers so far, we've got free, which is always good. We got the homestead protection, we got wages, pension, stuff like that. We've got insurance, and we've got privacy. So what's number 4 on our?
Number 4 is going to be your traditional entity structuring. So that's where the LLCs come into place, right? So let's use real estate. Simple example: you have a property, you buy a property in Texas, or you buy a property in California. You're going to want to create, at a minimum, an LLC to own that property, so that you personally don't own it. Because in the U.S., liability generally follows ownership. So if somebody slips and falls on your property, even though you may not even be at fault, because it's your property, you've got, strict liability. They're going to come after the owner. Or if the boiler, in your apartment blows and injures the family, or anything like that happens, the owner's responsible. So you don't want you to be the owner. You want an LLC to be the owner. So that should, even in California, although it's been getting worse and worse on people piercing the corporate veil, but generally speaking, a limited liability company should limit your liability to whatever is inside the LLC. The problem is that doesn't solve the other problem, which is something happens unrelated to your property, right? So you get into a car accident, or you run over the little lady, and now there's a judgment against, I'm sorry, I'm picking you, Gary, but now Gary, we got into a car accident, I have a judgment against Gary. Now it's what does he own? And so I know he doesn't own property directly, because at least he's gotten to that stage where he has an LLC. But if Gary lives in, I'm not divulging private information, Gary lives in California. So it's hey, you have a California LLC. In California, they're just going to hand over the shares of the LLC units to me to satisfy my judgment. So that's why you want to have that entity, or a separate entity, like in Wyoming or Delaware, or if you live in Texas now is a great way to do it, to have that LLC own the property LLC that then owns the property. So that's a little bit of kind of basic entity structuring. So that we call that entity structuring. Again, insurance would be your first line of defense. Have a little privacy, especially we just talked about setting it up in Wyoming so nobody can find it. And then if insurance fails for whatever reason and people find out who you are or whatever, boom, you've got LLCs now that are structured to maximize your protection. It's not the end all be all either. Because some judges, California being a good one, is Wyoming has, the reason we use Wyoming is because something called charging order protection, where the remedy available in Wyoming is only my ability to get Gary's distribution. So if Gary distributes or the LLC was going to distribute money to Gary, I get to intercept that to pay my judgment. But a judge in California could be you know what? I'm not going to apply Wyoming law. I'm going to apply California law because it happened here in California. The property's in California. So the judges may not, do what you want them to do. So there's that issue, right? And so especially for us who live in California, that becomes an issue. So then you got to go to the next layer, right? And so the next layer is more of the trust layer, right? I think so. So there's a difference between a living trust, which is there just to avoid probate, which by the way has zero asset protection value whatsoever. If you have a living trust and you think you've got some kind of asset protection, you don't. All you have is which is great, is you avoid probate. So when you pass away, you don't have to go through the expensive and time-consuming probate process. It goes, it's an expedited process. But from a protection standpoint, you got zero. But if you create what's called an asset protection trust, that is the gold standard of entity structuring. It's kind of still part of entity structuring, arguably, but instead of just using LLCs and LPs, we use an asset protection trust. And the beauty of a trust is that it actually, just like a living trust, it removes ownership altogether, because a trust doesn't have owners. They have beneficiaries and they have trustees. They don't have no owners. So if I sue Gary doesn't own the trust. The trust is its own separate legal thing on the side, and there's no ultimate owner. Gary's just the beneficiary. And if structured properly, you get that asset protection from the trust. Now, with asset protection trust, you can go domestic. Most people set them up in Nevada because they have the shortest statute of limitations, meaning after 2 years, it's almost impossible to argue fraudulent transfer. And you do this for fraudulent reasons. And then some people like to go offshore just to kind of remove even the next layer, which is I'm going to remove it from the jurisdiction of the judge, because now the judge, in Nevada has, jurisdiction over the trustee in Nevada. But if I go to the Cook Islands or Nevis or BVI, then the judge, they have zero jurisdiction over there. So that's the next layer where, but again, that's not impenetrable either, because with an asset protection trust, the judge still, pick on Gary. Gary's got some fancy offshore protection trust. And so Gary's like, hey, I don't own anything. It's like, it's owned by this trust. I've already written a letter to the trustee demanding, and he's like ignoring me because that's what the documents say, ignore. And the judge is like, Gary, I don't believe you. I think if you don't freaking get that money back onshore and transfer the money, I'm throwing you in jail, my friend, for contempt of court. And that's what's happened in the past. Like, people have spent a year in jail. Talk to Mr. Anderson or talk to Mr. Lawrence. Those are kind of the two famous cases where the judge just didn't believe them and they ended up throwing them in jail. And then there's a time. So maybe this is where it gets good. Like, if you're in jail after a year, the judge is like, okay, Gary probably is telling the truth, because why would Gary spend a year in jail? Right. So at some point they get let go because they're like, okay, you must have been telling the truth. But anyway, so that's the next layer, which is the asset protection trust. And then the last one, which is really the fancy schmancy, and again, this would only apply to the small, if you have a huge estate, right? Multiple millions, and you wanted the ultimate, is something we call it we call it equity stripping, meaning using the other five, right? So still using LLCs in conjunction with insurance, right? Insurance in conjunction with LLCs, in conjunction with asset protection trusts, because typically a trust will own your LLCs. Now you bring in this concept of equity stripping, which is basically acting like your own bank, right? So Gary would create his own bank, his own LLC. And so think about when you get a mortgage or even a home line line of credit, right? So the bank lends you $500,000 against your home. What do? They put a lien on your home, and then that $500,000 lien, that's not available for creditors, right? If I sue Gary and I foreclose on his home, I got to pay the first mortgage, Bank of America. I got to pay the second mortgage, right? The HELOC from JP Morgan, whatever. And there's nothing left over. So this is, for example, this is just Gary setting up his own LLC and putting a second lien. So essentially removing the equity from the home and putting it into an LLC in a safe place. We do that with businesses as well. So like if you have a medical office and you own all this expensive equipment, or maybe you just have a real estate business and you own the building itself, well, why don't you have the ownership of that equipment in another LLC and just lease it back to the business again, so the business no longer owns the property. It works well with like dentists and doctors, all that expensive medical equipment. Like if that medical equipment can be owned by a separate LLC and just leases it back to the company. So whether it's loans or leasing arrangements, intellectual property and stuff, there's a lot of ways you can remove equity from a business or a property, put it into a safe place, like an LLC in Wyoming that's owned by an asset protection trust. And that's like next level. And the challenge with that one I felt is it's complicated, right? And it's tough because if you as the client don't understand what's going on with your structure, it's difficult for you to really keep it. But those are the 6 layers. And I think the ultimate asset protection is a combination of all 6. Like I said, I mean, I'm thinking like the perfect one would be, let's say just a simple thing, like you have a property, right? So I was like, oh, great. I have some insurance on the property. The property is owned by an LLC that's owned by another LLC that's in Wyoming that's owned by an asset protection trust. I know, by the way, there's another LLC over here that's stripping away equity from all these things anyway. And that LLC is owned by a trust, right? So it can get complicated, but those are really 6. And my point is, not everybody needs everything. Going back to my analogy on the clothing, not everybody needs a winter coat. Like if you live in Chicago, like my wife and her family used to live, and there's a blizzard, yes, you need a winter coat. But if you're in California, meaning you've just got a rental property for the first time, you don't need the winter coat. You don't need the asset protection trust. But if you live in Chicago during a blizzard, you're not going to walk out with a t-shirt and shorts because you'll freeze to death. And so if you've got a large estate, a lot of properties, multiple millions, tens of hundreds of millions, you're going to wear a winter coat. You're not going to wear a layer. And again, I didn't think of this either, but and you don't just wear the winter coat, right? You put a t-shirt on and then a sweater and then the winter coat goes on, right? So it's not just like straight winter coat on your bare skin. So anyway, so that was the analogy of the 6 layers, and hopefully I didn't lose anybody when I went through that analysis.
No, I'm sure you did. But I think people are going to be like, oh man, I need to add more layers. But I think the bulk of people are, you're doing the insurance, you're doing the entities. Now, I think most people aren't doing, Wyoming and aren't doing the asset protection trust, but there are things that people can be doing that protects them just a little bit more.
I think the vast majority of people, if you're a real estate investor out there and you own a bunch of properties, right? I think what'll cover 90% of you, and even these will cover you 80% of it. So it's like the 80-20 rule. Get a good insurance. You can get a good insurance policy on the property. And if you can get an umbrella policy on top of that, great. Put your property in an LLC that's in the state where the property is located. No need to go crazy. If I'm in California, I'm going to put in a California, because that's where the property is anyway. I'm bound by California law anyway. So put it in California LLC if I live in California. If I live in Texas, Texas LLC. If I live in Ohio, an Ohio LLC. Then have those LLCs owned by a Wyoming company or an entity that's in a state like a Wyoming, like a Nevada, like a Delaware, like a Texas, that has top-notch asset protection in case you get sued from the outside. And that's you're good. That probably covers the vast majority of it. Insurance plus LLC plus the Wyoming or the specific states, then you're covered. And then once you get to a certain level, and it also depends on what you're like. Are you a heart surgeon? Or are you an Uber driver? Like, well, actually, Uber driver, you got liability because you can crash. But like, it's like if I'm a passive real estate investor, I'm not creating that much liability. If I'm a heart surgeon, a lot of liability. If I'm so an Uber driver actually driving all the time is probably a high liability. So that'll dictate whether, and then how big is your estate? Is it 5 million, 3 million, 1 million, 100 million? That'll also dictate how many more layers do I need to put on, or do I need to put on that sweater? Do I need to put on that winter coat, or am I good with a long sleeve shirt?
Yeah, I think what you mentioned earlier is really knowing your insurance policy, and I think most people don't. They'll know maybe your deductible and your basic coverage, but really going into it, and that's really important for your loan covenants as well, because we had an issue with one of our loans where, based on the DSCR, the lender wouldn't actually fix something. There was a small window if we had a big insurance claim. And that caused all issues when we were going to close. So really knowing your policy and making sure you're covered in your loan docs as well when it comes to insurance is important. So paying a consultant or if maybe it's one-time consultant just to know the basics so that you know what to look for the next time.
And just because, and I don't want to knock on, so I apologize if you've got insurance brokers, insurance agents that are going to watch this, but from a legal standpoint, it depends on who's selling you the policy. Is this an independent insurance broker, right? Who can sell you policies from all different places? They have fiduciary duties. They have a lot of responsibility. They got to act in the best interest of you, right? But if they're a dedicated insurance agent that just works for this insurance company, their loyalty is to the insurance company. They're not there to get you the best thing. They're there to get to the thing. And so just because the agent tells you something, listen to them. But it doesn't mean that they're acting necessarily in your best interest, especially from a legal standpoint, which again, it's why it's not a bad idea, especially if you're talking big numbers, to spend $1,500, right? An ounce of prevention, have an attorney, not me, because I don't know, I have a hard time reading these policies, but an insurance attorney will review it, will tell you, hey, this is what you're covered for. This is what you're not covered for. Do you want to add something else no, I'm good with that. I don't need that, or I've got that covered somewhere else. At least you're understanding, you're aware of what's covered, versus having a surprise when there's a claim and you get the denial letter because of paragraph 73B footnote 7, you were excluded.
Yeah. Absolutely. Reading those documents makes your eyes bleed, but if you can't do it like me, get someone that can. Well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing 6 layers of asset protection. Really appreciate it. Really beneficial. Where can listeners find out more about you and find all your content that you put out?
Thank you. I have a ton of content on YouTube, on my YouTube channel, Mauricio Rauld. I'm really trying to blow that up this year. So if you've not gone over there, I'd appreciate that. I've got like 200, 300 videos by now over there. A subscribe would be amazing. LinkedIn is where I kind of do my daily thought stuff, and I just try and add value there. And then I discovered Instagram at Mauricio Rauld. So I just started doing Instagram. I'm doing stories. You'll probably see this podcast pop up there today. So it's hard to miss me, but really appreciate you guys following my stuff.
Absolutely. Well, this is Gary Lipsky signing off. I'll be back next week with another informative episode on the Real Estate Investor Podcast. To all of our listeners, thanks for joining us. And if you like this episode, please head over to iTunes or Stitcher and subscribe, and leave a review, as it will help us reach more people. And if you'd like to learn more about what we do at Break of Day Capital, head over to our website at breakofdaycapital.com and sign up for our newsletter and fill out our investor application. We'll talk to you next week.